So if everyone will open their Bibles to Leviticus chapter 25, our study tonight involves the idea of the year of Jubilee. This is maybe our fourth or fifth lesson that we have kind of centered thoughts around the idea of Sabbath. We looked at the Sabbath day itself in a couple of lessons. Last week we looked at the Sabbath year in the first part of Leviticus 25, where every 7 years they were to take the whole year off and let the land rest. So we dealt with that last week. And tonight we're going to deal with the Sabbath year that occurs every 50 years, called the year of Jubilee. It begins in Leviticus 25, verse 8. And so I'm just going to read this. Several verses so that you can get the background, and then we'll come back and we'll work through it and try to make some sense of it and draw some applications. Beginning verse 8. You shall count 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7 years, so that the time of the 7 weeks of years shall give you 49 years. Then you shall sound the loud trumpet on the 10th day of the 7th month. On the day of atonement, you shall sound the trumpet throughout all your land. You shall consecrate the 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you, when each of you shall return to his property, and each of you shall return to his clan. That 50th year shall be a jubilee for you. In it you shall neither sow nor reap what grows of itself, nor gather the grapes from the undressed vines, for it is a jubilee. It shall be holy to you. You may eat the produce of the field. In this year of Jubilee, each of you shall return to his property. And if you make a sale to your neighbor or buy from your neighbor, you shall not wrong one another. You shall pay your neighbor according to the number of years after the Jubilee, and he shall sell to you according to the number of years for crops. If the years are many, you shall increase the price. If the years are few, you shall reduce the price, for it is the number of crops that he is selling to you. You shall not wrong one another, but you shall fear your God, for I am Yahweh your God. Therefore you shall do my statutes and keep my rules, perform them. Then you will dwell in the land securely. The land will yield its fruit, and you will eat your fill and dwell in it securely. And if you say, what shall we eat in the 7th year, if we may not sow or gather in our crop, I will command my blessing on you in the 6th year, so that it will produce a crop sufficient for 3 years. When you sow in the 8th year, you will be eating some of the old crop. You shall eat the old until the 9th year, when its crop arrives. Excuse me. 23. The land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. For you are strangers and sojourners with me, and in all the country you possess, you shall allow a redemption of the land. And it goes on, and I want to skip a few verses to verse 35. If your brother becomes poor and cannot maintain himself with you, you shall support him as though he were a stranger and a sojourner, and he shall live with you. Take no interest from him or profit, but fear your God, that your brother may live beside you. You shall not lend him your money at interest, nor give him your food for profit. I am Yahweh your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God. If your brother becomes poor beside you and sells himself to you, you shall not make him serve as a slave. He shall be with you as a hired worker and as a sojourner. He shall serve with you until the year of Jubilee. Then he shall go out from you, he and his children with him, and go back to his own clan and return to the possession of his fathers. For they are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves. And it goes on. So I'm not sure if this is the first time you've read this, that some of this makes a lot of sense. It takes a little working through it and working it out to try to understand what maybe is going on here. But it's something along this line. Every 50 years, it says that you are to celebrate what is known as an entire year called a year of Jubilee. It's similar to the Sabbath year. The Sabbath year in the first verses of chapter 25 is celebrated every 7th year. It's a Sabbath year. The year of Jubilee, however, is to be celebrated on the year after 7 Sabbath years, 7 times 7 being 49 years, and then the year after is the 50th year. As we indicated last week, there's no real record where the children of Israel ever kept these Sabbath years or even the Jubilee. And so we dealt with that last week with the Sabbath year. If you didn't hear that one, I would recommend you go back and listen to that, because not necessarily what I'm saying, but what the scriptures are saying. It's very interesting. Great information is given on these Sabbath years, and so this one now is we're just building as the scriptures unfold to tell us what these are all about. So this one is the 50th year, and just a couple of things that we'll try to bring this out, summarize, so that you can kind of get a feel for what's taking place. First of all, they're told that they're not allowed to sow a crop. They're not allowed to use their fields for harvesting. So they're not allowed to sow the fields. They're not allowed to plant seed. They're not allowed to do anything. If they did not do that in the 49th year, and again, they're not doing it in the 50th year, that's 2 years in a row where the land is required to lie fallow with no crops being planted and no crops being harvested for 2 years in a row. And so the question arose, as in the reading, Lord, how are we going to survive those 2 years? How are we going to make ends meet? How are we going to eat? And it's an amazing, miraculous story that the Lord gave us, we just read. And that is, I'm going to give you, this is in verse, somewhere around verse 21, I'm sorry. Yahweh says, I'm going to command my blessing on you in the 6th year, so that it will produce a crop sufficient for 3 years. In other words, in the 6th year, which then would be what? The 48th year, if we're counting correctly. In the 48th year, I'm going to create a crop so abundant, a harvest that's so abundant for you that you're going to be able to live 3 years off of 1 year. Therefore, you're not going to need to plant your crop next year or the following year. You're not going to need to do that, because I've already supplied for you by faith. If you'll just trust me, if you'll trust what I'm telling you, you are my people. I am your God. I will take care of you. And so I will abundantly supply in the 6th year for 3 years, and you will not have to worry about this. It also goes on to say there in about verses 11, 12, I think that's where I want to be, that you're not allowed to sow a crop, but in verse 12, it says you can eat. You can't sow a new crop, either in the 49th year or in the 50th year. But if the field produces a return just as a result of what had happened previously. You are allowed to eat that food that is growing. So you don't get to sow, but you do get to eat. And God says he promises that he will take care of them. So first of all, this is the Jubilee is a time just like the Sabbath day. It's a time of rest, a time of ceasing work. They're no longer allowed to work, and in this case for 2 years. The 49th year, which would be the 7th Sabbath year, and then the 50th year, which would be the year of Jubilee. You're not allowed to work, but I'll take care of you and I will provide for you. That is the promise. So why? What is this all about? So there's two things, two main differences or two main purposes of the Jubilee year that's different from the rest of them. And that is this. If you have fallen on hard times during the 50 years, if anyone has fallen upon hard times and they had to sell their property, the 50th year, they get their property back. Every 50 years, it doesn't matter if you sold your property away to someone, they have to give it back to you on the 50th year. And so you'll never be perpetually poor. That's the underlying purpose of this. And the Lord goes on to say, this is not your land anyway, by the way, verse 23, the land is mine. So don't complain. Don't come to me and say, well, I bought this land and now I got to give it back. And they don't have to pay anything for it. Don't come to me, Yahweh is saying, with that complaint, because number one, you didn't buy the land to begin with. What you bought was a crop. You bought a year's worth of crops. And so you count ahead. So if I'm in the 35th year of the Jubilee year, of the Jubilee period, there's still 15 years left. I'm not buying the land. I'm only buying 15 years worth of crops. So that's specified in the text that I just read a moment ago. You're not buying the land. You are buying a crop. If you only have 5 years left before Jubilee, then you only are buying 5 years worth of crops. And so you adjust the price accordingly so that in the 50th year, you return the land to its original owners, so that those people will not remain and live in poverty, and so that that family does not live in poverty its entire life and existence. So first of all, there is a release of the debt that someone might have encountered when they became poor. They went into some type of poverty. They sold several years worth of crops, but they're released from that. Notice in verse 10, you shall observe the 50th year, you shall proclaim liberty, or you shall proclaim freedom throughout the land to all its inhabitants. If you have sold yourself into hardship, and this is what we read in verses 35 and following, if you sold yourself to someone because of your poverty, you gave yourself to them for a period of time, every 50 years, you'll be set free. But you're not supposed to be treated as a slave. Now, they did recognize slavery to non-Jews. If someone was a non-Israelite, then they did recognize slavery, but no Jewish person born of the 12 tribes would be recognized as a slave, but would be recognized as a servant because they fell on hard times. They fell into poverty. They had to give themselves to somebody else because they couldn't pay their bills. and therefore they did that. But they would be paid a wage as a hired worker. They would not be loaned money on the front end with interest attached to it. But again, at the end of 50 years, or on the 50th year, the year of Jubilee, then they would be released from their requirement to be a servant of somebody else. So there was a release that was taking place. Secondly, there is redemption of the land. The land would be redeemed or reclaimed. So really, these words on your screen, release, redemption, and restoration, overlap one another and kind of help one another to explain each other. So we're going to redeem the land. It's my land, but I had to sell it to somebody else. But on the 50th year, I get to redeem the land. The land comes back to me, or it's restored back to me. So the verse 10 is the key there. You shall consecrate the 50th year, proclaim liberty throughout the land to all the inhabitants, and it shall be a jubilee when each of you shall return to his property, and each of you shall return to his clan. In some of the reading that I went through in studying for this, I didn't realize this, but the nation of Israel was divided into certain groups. And so first of all, it was divided into tribes. And so you have the 12 tribes of Jacob. And each tribe then was divided into clans. And then each clan, a clan is mentioned there in verse 10, end of verse 10, says you shall return to your clan. But then each clan was divided up into the individual families that made up the clan. The clan was supposed to take care of itself. The family was supposed to take care of itself. So if somebody in the family fell on hard times, somebody else in the family was supposed to pick up the slack and help them out. That didn't always happen, or maybe there might not be anybody else in the family that could help them, and they had to do whatever was necessary. But it was never permanent. They were never sold into permanent slavery, and the land was never permanently taken away from them. So that's what's going on here. And that doesn't seem to have a whole lot of spiritual value necessarily. It sounds more economic than anything else. However, I think we're going to see that the concept of Jubilee took on a new role as time progressed. Number one, since there's no real evidence that they ever practiced this, and yet, as we learned last week, when the children of Israel did not practice part of the covenant, God did it for them. And we learned that last week. If you missed last week's lesson, I really encourage you to go back and listen to it on YouTube, because it really brings out how that God keeps the covenant even if man does not keep his part. So there's a covenant between God and Israel. And there are many times throughout Scripture where Israel did not keep their part of the covenant. And yet God kept it for them. And we went into that last week. We'll see that again tonight. In that, where if Israel did not keep the year of Jubilee, then where did God keep it for them? And what we'll see here is that it really went all the way to the time of exile in Babylon. And so I would invite you to turn with me to the book of Isaiah. And let's go to the book of Isaiah, chapter 45 first. Now, this may come as a little bit of a surprise, maybe even a shock to some of us, but scholars do not agree, but the book of Isaiah seems to have two parts, and the same author did not write both parts, although the book of Isaiah has been collected as one book, as if Isaiah wrote all of it. There's some pretty good arguments that would suggest that something different might take place. Now, for me, it doesn't really matter, and it certainly doesn't matter in the point that I want to make tonight. But I have to make the point in order to make the point I want to make. I hope that made sense. The first, say, 39 chapters of Isaiah obviously are written before or at the very beginning of the Babylonian captivity, because in those chapters, it deals with the latter kings of Israel, especially some of those chapters specify Hezekiah, who was not the last king of Judah, but he was one of the last kings of Judah. And so the first part of the book of Isaiah is a prophecy about what's going to happen. And Israel has been involved in idolatry and sin and false worship. And the prophet is telling them that there's a nation that's coming and will bring them into punishment. However, when we get to chapter 45 of Isaiah, the very first verse talks about an individual king named Cyrus. Well, Cyrus doesn't come along for at least 70 years after Hezekiah, a long time after Hezekiah. Cyrus is not even Babylonian or Chaldean. Cyrus is the king of Persia. If you know your Bible history, the children of Israel go into Babylonian captivity. They're there for a period of time, and then the kingdom of Persia, the Medes and the Persians, conquer Babylon, and Cyrus is the king who does that. So when we get to about chapter 45 of Isaiah, we're at the end of the exile of Israel. The first few chapters of Isaiah, first 39 say, are the beginning of the exile. The last chapters of Isaiah deal with the end of the exile. And in fact, some of the children of Israel have already returned back to Jerusalem and they're coming home. That's the point I really want to make, because that's the point about Jubilee. Cyrus was the king of Persia who initiated the return of the children of Israel back to their homeland. I hope now you want to see the point I really want to make is that the second part of Isaiah is describing God's Jubilee. God's Jubilee. The oppressed of Israel have been in bondage in Babylon. The oppressed people of God, of Israel, have been in slavery, exile for, I don't know, almost 70 years probably. And now they're returning to their land. That is the very definition of Jubilee. They return to, the poor get to return to their land. I'm hoping I'm making the connection and you're seeing it in your mind. When we read the latter chapters of Isaiah, and I'm not going to read all of those tonight, but there's one in particular I want us to look at. But I want you to see that, in essence, the second half of the book of Isaiah is somewhat descriptive of the same thing that we just read out of Leviticus. When man does not practice Jubilee, God does. God brought his people home. God brought his people back into the land. And other prophets dealt with this as well, not just Isaiah, but the passage in Isaiah that I want us to focus on is crucially important. So if you look at the overall picture in, say, the latter chapters of the prophet Isaiah as the return home from captivity, the release of the captives back into their land. It starts to make sense. The Bible starts to come together. Isaiah is not randomly writing about something that that we already have not been introduced to. Now, the word Jubilee does not appear. The term Jubilee does not appear in the book of Isaiah, but look what does. So I want to go to chapter 61. Isaiah 61. And this is what we read. Now, this is just one incident. There are others prior to chapter 61 that we could refer to. But the reason I want to bring this one up is because this one is these are verses that Jesus will quote when he preaches in Nazareth. And we're going to go look at that too in just a moment, where Jesus himself quotes these verses. But let's read them from the prophet himself. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because Yahweh has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to those in captivity, the opening of the prison to those who are bound, and to proclaim the year of Yahweh's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, to grant to those who mourn in Zion, to give them a beautiful headdress instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, the garment of praise instead of a faint spirit, that they may be called oaks of righteousness, the planting of the Lord, that he may be glorified. They shall build up the ancient ruins. They shall raise up the former devastations. They shall repair the ruined cities and the devastations of many generations. And it continues. So, many scholars reading this, in fact, most, and it's almost without much disagreement, believe that this is specifically referring to Jubilee, or the year of Jubilee, because there's so much common language here. The proclaiming liberty to captives, opening the prisons to those who are bound. And then verse 2 almost says it, to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord. What is the favorable year of the Lord? What is the year of the Lord's favor? Many people say that's a direct reference to Leviticus 25, the year of Jubilee, where those who have been in servitude to someone else have been released to come home, where those who were held captive by their own choices and by their own mistakes, yet held captive anyway, are set free and allowed to go back to their own land. And so all of this in Isaiah is about the return of Israel to their land. And so it's not about individuals, but it's about the entire nation who has been set free from its exile and its bondage to come home. And this was the year of the Lord's favor. This is Jubilee. I think that it's probably correct. I think that's exactly what's being prophesied here. So as the children of Israel come home from their many years of bondage, they're coming back to their land. They get their land back. And God has held it for them, because if you recall in Leviticus 25, he says there, the land's not yours. This land is mine. I own this land. And so for all of these years, God has held it in reserve for them, last week we noted, last week we noted that the scriptures tell us that the exile represented 70 years of land of Sabbath years that were never honored, Sabbath years that were never celebrated. And we talked last week about how that if the people didn't keep the Sabbath year, then God did, and he sent them into exile for 70 years. In those 70 years, the land rested. For those 70 years, no one worked the land. It just lied there, devastated, but it was not sown, it was not harvested for 70 years. God kept the Sabbath year 70 times during the exile. However, now it's Jubilee. You get to come home. Now you get to come back to the land. You who have been poor, you who have wasted and squandered your existence because you didn't obey me all of these years. Now I'm bringing you back. And so God, again, creates his own Jubilee. As he created his own Sabbath year celebration, now he's creating his own Jubilee. Now, because of that and other things that we could read throughout the book of Isaiah, so I would encourage you, if this is of interest to you, I'd go back and I would read the entire book of Isaiah and note how there's a change around chapter 40 of the book of Isaiah. Prior to chapter 40 is talking primarily about going into Babylonian exile. But after chapter 40, it's talking about coming back from exile, and read it from a perspective of a Jubilee understanding. Maybe it will help you to understand the book of Isaiah a little bit better. To further this idea, then, I would like for us to look at what Jesus said about this. So if you'll now go to Luke chapter 4. Should be a somewhat familiar story to you. This is at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. This was in chapter 4. This occurs just after the temptations of Christ. It says in verse 15 that he came, 16, he came to Nazareth, which was his hometown, where he was brought up. And as was his custom, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, and he stood up to read. Notice, this occurred on the Sabbath day. It's important. Sometimes we let the setting escape us. We don't spend a moment and say, where is Jesus? Well, he's in his hometown where he grew up. And secondly, he's in the synagogue where he grew up on the Sabbath day. And he stood up to read. Verse 17. The scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll. He found the place where it was written. He's about to quote from Isaiah 61 we just read. And it says in Luke, and if you were to compare Luke with Isaiah, there's a little difference. There's a little difference in the way it's worded. I'm not going to make a big deal about that, but there is somewhat of a difference. And I think the difference probably has to do with Jesus' intent. What is he intending to convey? Verse 18, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news. So notice what Jesus has a scroll in his hand. He has unrolled it to this place in Isaiah, and he's just reading it. So I'll go back. This is what he reads. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives, recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Not exactly word for word. He did not quote the whole passage, but he quoted sufficiently for us to know where it is that he's quoting from and to notice the things that he is emphasizing. First of all, he's emphasizing good news. The poor have good news. What is the good news? You're not going to be poor anymore. If you read this with Jubilee eyes, he's saying, as he quotes Isaiah 61, you're not going to be poor anymore. I'm telling you good news. The poor get their land back. I am proclaiming to you liberty to those who are in bondage, liberty to those of you who have been held captive, liberty to those of you who have kind of sold yourselves to the world around you for whatever. I'm here to proclaim freedom for you. I'm here to set you free. Recovering of sight to the blind. This does not occur in Leviticus, the sight to the blind, but it does talk about recovery. Notice the wording. I'm proclaiming to you recovery. I am proclaiming to you freedom and liberty. That's the wording, and that's exactly the wording that we found in Leviticus 25. It's also the wording that we found in Isaiah 61. Liberty, recovery, restoration, release, all of the concepts are the same. Recovery of sight to the blind. Now, if you go back and read in Isaiah, other scriptures in the latter part of the book of Isaiah, you will read this about the blind receive their sight. And he's setting at liberty those who are oppressed, and the emphasis, I'm here to proclaim the year of Yahweh's favor. Again, most likely a reference to the year of Jubilee, where the favor of God falls upon the people, especially the poor, who reclaim their lost possessions, who reclaim their lives, who reclaim their own dignity, are allowed to go back to their family heritage. They're allowed to go back to their family's possessions and start their life over. In other words, Jubilee is a reset. Jubilee in Leviticus 25, Jubilee in Isaiah 61, and Jubilee in Luke 4. It's all about reset. You get to start over. That's the joy of Jubilee. That's the underlying teaching of what Jubilee is all about. It is, we've lived in a mess long enough. And so now I get to start over again. So in Leviticus, it's you're no longer obligated to your neighbor who bailed you out. You're no longer obligated to them. You get to go home. And when you sold your land, guess what? Now you get it back. And you don't have to pay anything for it. It's yours for free. In Isaiah 61, you are redeemed from bondage. You are released from bondage to these other countries, and you are given the freedom to go back to your homeland and start your life all over again. And in Luke 4, we haven't finished reading it, so let's do that. Verse 20, Luke 4:20. He rolled up the scroll and he gave it back to the attendant, and he sat down. And the eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. He began to say to them, "Today, this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." Today, I'm going to embellish it a little bit. I'm going to put words into it that aren't there, but I think are implied. today, Jubilee has been fulfilled. You didn't keep it. All of these years, you didn't keep it, but guess what? God's going to keep it for you. He kept it for you when he let you go back home from bondage in Babylon and Assyria and Persia. But he's keeping it now for you for all eternity, because he has sent me to fulfill this text for you. He has sent me. Jesus is saying, I am here to be the fulfillment of that promise. And that is what? The poor will not be poor anymore. The captives will be set free. The oppressed and those that are burdened and brokenhearted and those that mourn. You go back and read Isaiah 61 and you read the expanded text. It talks about people there who are broken, people who are mourning, in mourning, people who are captives and need to be set free. And Jesus is saying, I'm the one that does that for you. I have arrived. For me, the importance of studying Old Testament is to understand what it says, to understand what it meant to the people originally, but then to see how Jesus himself fulfills it all. Jesus said that I am Lord of the Sabbath. You believe in me, and I am the Lord. I am the King over the Sabbath. Jesus says that. Here he says, I am the one who is ushering in a new age. I am the one that is bringing into the world the favorable year of God, or stated another way, the year of God's favor. God's favor is present, Jesus says, in me, in himself. We take a passage from the Old Testament and it seems unimportant or maybe even not really meaningful. But what has happened with Jubilee is that it became symbolic. Initially, Jubilee in Leviticus was not symbolic. It was an actual year that was supposed to be practiced, where people could go back to their homes and start all over again, economically, financially. But it became symbolic in that the year of Jubilee is the year God brought the exiles back home to Israel. It is God's Jubilee. And again, the text, I think in Leviticus 25, says it is God's Jubilee. It is God's Jubilee. It's God's land, and God owns the land, and he let Israel back in. So that's the prophetic symbolism. But then Jesus says it's even deeper and bigger and more important than that. And that is, in me, all of the Jubilee has been fulfilled. That is, all the poor and all the captives and all the broken and all the blind will find rest. So we looked at, I'm going to go back to the slide, this one. The purpose of Jubilee is release, redemption, restoration. But we can also read into the Leviticus text that it is also rest, because it says don't do any work. The very same words that we read about Sabbath are given to us about Jubilee. You are to rest for an entire year, and the land is to rest as well. But it's also a time of remembrance. And so a couple of times when I read Leviticus 25 just a moment ago, it says, here's what you need to remember. Don't treat your poor, don't treat your family members as slaves, because you all once were slaves in Egypt. Remember, he's saying, you remember, you were a slave too. Your family was you were all slaves. I set you free. And so Jubilee, as well as Sabbath, is a time to remember the deliverance that God gave to them. And Jesus is coming along and he's saying, oh, you need to remember that deliverance, but I'm telling you that I'm here now to be the one who delivers you as well. And also, by virtue of the name itself, Jubilee, it implies celebration, rejoicing. Now, I don't have time to go into what the Hebrew word means. Actually, the Hebrew word doesn't really have anything to do with Jubilee. The Hebrew word there that is translated Jubilee is really trumpets, blowing of trumpets. So there is some connotation attached to the blowing of trumpets to victory. I would say the walls of Jericho. If you'll recall, when they marched around the city of Jericho, what were they told to do? Blow the trumpets. When they blew the trumpets, the walls fell down. When the walls fell down, the children of Israel marched into Jericho and captured it easily. And there was celebration and rejoicing. So you see how the blowing of trumpets kind of implies celebration, festivity, jubilee. So that's kind of how that name came about. I'm not really going to go into a lot of detail on that because that's not my point tonight. The point is, it's all about release. It's about redemption. It's about restoration, but it's also about rest. It's also about remembrance, and it's also about rejoicing, but it's even more than that. And so as we try to bring this to somewhat of a conclusion, what is the ultimate meaning of Jubilee, looking at all three of these texts? Leviticus 25, Isaiah 61, and Luke 4. It means forgiveness. We can draw the theme of forgiveness out of Jubilee because the year of Jubilee started on the Day of Atonement. Go back to Leviticus 25, and it says, on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, the Day of Covering, literally, Yom Kippur means the Day of Covering of sin. On that day, you blow the trumpets and you start a celebration. And that's going to be every 50 years on Yom Kippur, you set people free. You forgive them. You forgive their debts. You forgive what they owe you, and you give them back their land. But notice also in Luke's version, it says, it uses a Greek word there, aphiemi, and it's in verse 18, where it says to set liberty. It means to forgive, to proclaim forgiveness to the captives. It's all about releasing people from whatever it is that they owe, whatever it is. If it is a financial debt or if it's a spiritual debt, it's all forgiven. So the meaning of Jubilee, first of all, is forgiveness, reset. We start over. It's a beautiful thing. Second, it's about freedom. It's about release. It's about liberty. These words are used in all three texts: liberty, and release, or freedom. And thirdly, it is about favor, the year of the Lord's favor. we can celebrate Jubilee, not like they did, but we can celebrate, you and I tonight can celebrate the favor of the Lord because he has forgiven us. He has given us freedom. He has preached through his son good news to us. He has extended his blessing and his favor upon his people when they returned to Israel from bondage, from when they returned from exile. He bestowed his favor upon them. He gave them their land back. He gave them an opportunity to start all over again, to reset. He does that with us through Jesus Christ, Jesus being the ultimate fulfillment of Jubilee. And now he makes these things available to us. And it is his favor that you and I live in on a daily basis. So we live in today, the favorable year of the Lord. And we proclaim that until he comes. He is our Jubilee. So ponder those things. We're through for the night, but there's just one more thing, and then we'll turn the recording off. We got one more lesson on this idea of Sabbath. I'm sure you probably didn't think that we could talk five or six lessons on a concept of keeping the Sabbath, an Old Testament remembrance, but I'm hoping that it's been meaningful for you. But I got one more to go, and that one we'll find in the book of Hebrews, because the Hebrew writer there says, and this is where we'll go next week, there still remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. There's still Sabbath yet to come. It's not about what they did back then. It's not about what we do now. It is about what God is still promising he's going to do. There still remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. That's in Hebrews 3 and 4. I'll have you encourage you to read that this week, and then we'll discuss it next week. All right, I'm finished for the night. We'll turn this off, and we'll take any questions that any of you might have.